I followed a dry creek bed to a hidden pump house. A widow said, "The county already signed my name away." Bryony Hale had $8, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools she'd carried since her last steady job on a water utility maintenance crew, and a habit of following any dry creek bed to see where it led. A habit that had led her, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten structure that kept her fed for a few weeks at a stretch. She was 21 years old, laid off 7 months earlier, when the regional water authority that employed her privatized its maintenance division, eliminating her entire position in a single round of contract changes. She had been moving through farm country ever since, taking whatever short-term work she could find. The privatization notice had come with barely 2 weeks' warning, and Bryony had spent the 7 months since relearning, farm town by farm town, that her particular skill with water infrastructure mattered a great deal less to most temporary employers than whether she had a fixed address and a reference from the last 6 months. She had grown up around exactly this kind of infrastructure her whole life, her own mother having worked water utility maintenance for nearly 2 decades before her, and she had learned, riding along on service calls from an early age, the particular patience such work required, understanding a mechanism's true condition the way another person might understand a familiar face. She followed a dry creek bed on a cool afternoon in early autumn, curious about a small structure she'd spotted from the road, and found a squat concrete pump house tucked into a hollow the creek's own banks had once concealed properly. The creek bed itself had run dry for what looked like several seasons, its cracked mud floor telling its own story of drought and neglect, and Bryony found herself wondering, following its winding path, exactly what kind of water infrastructure a structure this deliberately hidden might once have served. The door stood ajar, and Bryony found inside an elderly woman sitting on an overturned crate, a folder of papers spread across her lap, her expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been staring at the same documents for considerably longer than was doing her any good. "You're not from the county, I hope?" the woman said, looking up sharply. "I'm not from anywhere official," Bryony said. "I used to do water utility work. I saw the structure from the road and wondered what it was. I'm sorry to intrude." "You're not intruding," the woman said. "Name's Fay Renfrew. This land's been in my family for 3 generations, including this old pump house my husband once maintained for the county before he passed. I've just learned the county claims I signed away my rights to this exact parcel 8 months ago for a redevelopment project I've never once agreed to." "When did you supposedly sign this?" Bryony asked. 3 days after my husband's funeral," Fay said. "According to the document sitting in my lap right now. I don't remember signing anything that week. I barely remember that whole week at all, if I'm honest, grief having swallowed most of it entirely." Over the following hour, Fay told Bryony the fuller story of what had brought genuine confusion and fear into her own life these past several days. The county had recently begun a water infrastructure expansion project requiring additional easement rights along the creek, and had presented Fay with the signed consent form dated 8 months earlier, during the exact week of her husband's funeral, a document she had no memory of ever seeing, let alone signing. A representative showed up 2 days ago with this form already completed, already signed, simply informing me the easement was proceeding as agreed, Fay said. "I told him plainly I'd never agreed to anything of the sort. He showed me the signature, the date, and I found myself doubting my own certainty the moment I saw it, wondering whether grief had genuinely erased a memory I should have retained." "I don't understand how this happened," Fay said. "I don't remember any county representative visiting that week. I don't remember signing anything beyond funeral arrangements and sympathy cards, and yet, here's a document with what appears to be my own signature, dated precisely then. I've started to genuinely doubt my own memory," Fay admitted. "That's the part that frightens me most, more than the property itself." If I could forget something this significant, what else might I have simply lost entirely, without ever realizing it was gone? Grief does strange things to memory, particularly in the days immediately following a loss, Bryony said. But that's different from actually signing a document and forgetting it entirely. I don't think we should assume your memory failed before we've properly checked whether the document itself is even genuine. Do you have any other documents from around that same time that we could compare the signature against? Bryony asked. Something you know for certain you actually signed yourself. I might, Faye said. I kept a small box of paperwork from that week, mostly funeral-related. I haven't looked through it since, unable to face the memories it holds. They searched through the box together and found, among funeral home receipts and sympathy cards, a will document Faye had signed that same week with her attorney present. Its signature considerably different from the one on the county's consent form. The letters formed with a different slant and pressure that even an untrained eye could recognize as inconsistent. Faye's hands lingered on several of the sympathy cards as they worked, reading names she hadn't thought of in months, the search itself becoming considerably more emotional than either of them had anticipated when they'd first opened the box. I'd forgotten how many people came to that funeral, Faye said quietly, setting aside a card from a neighbor she hadn't spoken with since. I don't think I properly absorbed any of it at the time. Grief has a way of making even a crowded room feel entirely empty. This doesn't match, Bryony said, comparing the two signatures carefully, holding both documents up to the pump house's small window for better light. Whatever's on that county consent form, I don't think it's actually yours. Faye studied both signatures herself, her hands trembling slightly as the relief of a genuine explanation began to replace days of self-doubt. I hadn't let myself hope it might simply be someone else's error, or worse, she said. I'd nearly convinced myself I was losing my own mind along with everything else grief had already taken. I need to know this holds up properly, Faye said. I don't have money for a proper attorney, and I don't know how to formally dispute a county document without one. They contacted a rural legal aid attorney the following morning, a careful man named Foster Cray, whose name Bryony recognized from stories she'd heard traveling through other farm counties, and Cray reviewed both signatures with evident interest once he understood the situation. Cray's office, a modest storefront practice specializing in exactly this kind of rural property dispute, examined both documents carefully under proper lighting, cross-referencing the letter formation and pressure patterns with the particular thoroughness of someone who had seen forged signatures before and understood exactly what evidence a formal challenge actually required. This discrepancy is significant enough to warrant a formal handwriting analysis, Cray told them. If a qualified examiner confirms what appears obvious to the eye, this consent form becomes unenforceable, and the county's entire easement claim collapses along with it. How quickly can that analysis actually happen? Faye asked. I don't know how long the county expects me to simply accept their claim while a proper investigation unfolds. I'll have a preliminary opinion within the week, Cray said, and a formal analysis completed within 2. I don't think the county will want to press forward with any actual construction while this challenge remains unresolved, given the exposure a fraudulent consent form would create for their own project. The handwriting analysis, completed within the following 2 weeks, confirmed the signatures came from 2 different hands entirely, prompting Cray to file a formal challenge to the county's consent form, along with a request that the matter be investigated as potential fraud. The county's own investigation, prompted by Cray's formal complaint, ultimately traced the forged signature to a contractor's employee, who had apparently signed several consent forms himself across multiple properties, forging landowner signatures rather than properly obtaining consent during a rushed project timeline, a scheme that had gone undetected until Faye's own careful attention to her husband's memory happened to expose it. The county's own project manager visited Fay personally once the investigation's findings were confirmed, considerably more subdued than the confident representative who had first presented the fraudulent form. "I want to apologize directly on behalf of this office," he told her. "We trusted a contractor's paperwork without the kind of verification that clearly should have been standard practice from the start. I don't think any apology fully repairs the fear those days caused you, but I wanted you to hear it from me personally, rather than simply through a formal letter. I don't know how to describe what it feels like, after days of believing I'd somehow signed away my own family's land without remembering it, to learn the whole document was fabricated from the start," Fay told Bryony, once the investigation's findings were confirmed. "I'd nearly convinced myself grief had cost me more than simply my husband, that it had somehow cost me my own reliable memory as well." "Grief doesn't erase memory the way this made you fear," Bryony said. "Somebody simply took advantage of exactly how vulnerable that week left you, understanding you'd be too overwhelmed to immediately question a document that arrived so much later." The county's investigation ultimately uncovered 3 additional forged consent forms from the same contractor's employee, each one similarly targeting a landowner recently bereaved or otherwise vulnerable, a pattern that prompted the county to formally revise its consent process and require in-person witnessed signatures for any future easement agreements. Cray called Fay personally once the full pattern had been confirmed, sharing details he felt she deserved to know given her own crucial role in exposing it. "The other 3 victims weren't as fortunate as you were," he told her. "None of them had a document handy from the exact same week to compare against, the way your will happened to provide. Your case is very likely the reason this scheme didn't continue running considerably longer than it already had." "I don't like knowing 3 other people face this same fear," Fay said, "but I'm glad, at least, that finding it stopped it from happening to anyone else." Bryony stayed on at the property through that winter and the ones that followed, helping Fay maintain both the pump house and the surrounding land properly, the small structure that had first drawn her down a dry creek bed, becoming, gradually, something closer to a shared home than either of them had expected when a stranger first followed curiosity into the middle of somebody else's fear. She spent that first year restoring sections of the pump house that decades of her husband's own aging maintenance had gradually let slip since his death. Careful work considerably different from the frantic search that had first uncovered the fraud, understanding the particular satisfaction of caring properly for a structure a dead man had maintained faithfully for 30 years. She repaired the pump's own aging seals, cleared decades of sediment from the intake screen, and restored the small structure to something considerably closer to the working condition Fay's husband had once maintained it in. Fay, in turn, began speaking more openly about her husband's own work along the creek, sharing stories she'd kept largely to herself in the months since his passing, understanding gradually that sharing his memory rather than guarding it alone made the loss considerably easier to carry. "My husband would have been glad to know the truth finally protected what he spent 30 years maintaining," Fay told Bryony one evening, the 2 of them sitting together beside the pump house's small stove. "He always said careful attention to detail mattered more than people gave it credit for, whether that attention was pointed at a mechanism or at a signature that didn't quite match what it claimed to be. I think he'd have been glad about more than just the property being protected," Bryony said. "I think he'd have been glad you didn't have to face those days of self-doubt entirely alone, wondering whether grief had cost you your own memory along with everything else." Bryony wrote to her own mother that winter, describing the pump house and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine creek-following habit to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose she'd feared she might never find again after the privatization ended her own maintenance career. Her reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way Bryony remembered growing up with. "Your grandfather always said the right kind of stranger shows up exactly when a person's stopped expecting anyone to. Sounds like you found your way into exactly that kind of story, on exactly the right afternoon. Bryony thought some evenings that winter about the 7 months of towns and privatization notices that had led her to a dry creek bed on an ordinary autumn afternoon, and understood, watching Fay move through the pump house with a confidence that had barely existed the day they'd met, that she had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose her own mother had modeled decades before she was old enough to understand it. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of following simple curiosity into exactly the place a frightened widow needed a clear-eyed stranger to arrive. So, here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many fraudulent documents rely entirely on grief's own particular fog, counting on a person too overwhelmed to immediately question something that arrives claiming a memory they simply don't have? And what does it take? A stranger following a dry creek bed out of nothing more than curiosity, a will signed the same difficult week, an attorney willing to formally challenge what a county too easily assumed was settled, for that fraud to finally be exposed. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.